In this video, we're going to take a look at the order of operations, which helps us use a certain order of steps to simplify a mathematical expression. Anytime we simplify an expression, we are always going to follow these same steps. And we're going to use GEMDAS to help us remember what those steps are. Now, you may have seen PEMDAS, but GEMDAS is a little more inclusive, and it makes it easier for us to remember exactly what we're working with. And this tells us the order in which we're going to do certain things. So the G stands for groupings. So that could be anything like brackets or parentheses. That could also be our absolute value. We could use that for a square root. And it could also count as a fraction if we have to simplify that whole fraction before we can move on. So we're always going to start with those grouping symbols and then move on to the next step. Next will be exponents. So those, if we think back to our powers of 10 in scientific notation, are those little numbers up in the top that tell us how many times we're multiplying something by itself. And once we've done all exponents, we move into the multiplication or division step, where we work our way from left to right, and then the addition or subtraction step, where we work our way from left to right. So again, this doesn't mean that multiplication always comes first or addition always comes first. It just means that we move from left to right, and that part is going to be important to remember. And we're dealing with expressions now, and these are things without an equal sign. So if we look at this, there's no equal sign in any of these. They can have numbers, they can have variables, which are the letters, they can have operations, they can have signs, but there's never any equal sign. So an expression is anything here without the equal sign. Before we go into actually solving some of these expressions, we want to make sure that we know how to use the Desmos calculator. And there are a few different things that we are going to need to know how to be able to do. The first is dealing with exponents. So I'm going to bring my calculator over here. And our first question here is 5 cubed. So I'm going to start by typing in 5. And then I want to be able to use an exponent. You have two options. On your keyboard, you can hold down the Shift key and then the 6 button, and that will bump you up into the exponent level. Your other option is to click this little A to the B button, and that will bring you up into the exponent level. Then we type 3, and we have our answer on this side, and we can see that that is 125. So we're going to use the A to the B button for that exponent. If we look at our next one, that's -3 squared. So I'm just going to type that in exactly as it's written, -3, and then since this is squared, I can use the squared button, and that's going to give me an answer of -9. And to do that exponent, we did the A squared button. The next question is very similar to that, but instead we have parentheses around it. So again, I'm going to type it in exactly as it's written, and then you notice that Desmos will fill in that parenthesis for me, so I can just type that in. And then I want to make sure that I type in that exponent outside of the parentheses since it's outside in the problem. And notice that we get a different answer here. For this one, we get +9. That's because this is really -3 times -3, and we know that when we multiply two negatives, we get a positive. This first one that we did is saying -3 squared, which is just -3 times 3, which will give me -9. All right, next we want to do the square roots. So a couple different ways you can do this one. The first is to hit the square root button and then type in the number that you want. We can see that we get 11 here. And we know that the square root of 121 is 11. And our other option is if I type in SQRT, it will also give me the square root. And then I can type that in as well. Next, we have the absolute value of -25. So we are going to use the absolute value button and then type in -25, and we get our answer of 25. So we know what that answer is going to be because we know how to do absolute value, but the calculator is a nice backup. Lastly, for fractions, these can be a little tricky, so I'm going to start by typing in my fraction, and I can use the fraction button or the division symbol. If I use that fraction button, it'll get me set up here, so we have 1/4. Then I want to make sure I click outside the fraction before using my times sign and then typing in 12, and we get an answer of 3 there. So we're going to practice a lot with the Desmos calculator. There are some little tricks that you have to learn, but with lots of practice, we'll be good to go. So now we're going to simplify some of these expressions using the order of operations, and we're going to do these one step at a time. So my first step is the grouping symbol. So I'm going to look for any grouping symbols here, and I see that I have parentheses, so I'm going to start right here. So inside those parentheses, I'm going to do 6 minus 1, and that's going to give me 5. Everything else stays exactly the same because the only thing that I'm doing right now is working inside the grouping symbol. And if we look, there are no more grouping symbols, so we're finished with that step. Next, we move on to E, which is the exponent step. So I look and I see that I do have an exponent here. So that's that 2 squared. So we know that 2 squared is 4, but if I wasn't sure, I can always type it into the calculator. And then everything else stays exactly the same. We didn't change anything except for that 2 squared. I look, there are no more exponents, so my exponent step is good to go. Next, we move into that multiplication and division step. And again, with this one, we move from left to right. So I start on the left side of the page, and I move to the right, and right here, we see some division. So we're going to do that first. So 24 divided by 3 is 8. The rest of this stays exactly the same. The 5, the plus sign, the times 7, and the minus 4. I keep looking from left to right for any more multiplication or division, and I do see that I have 8 times 7 here. So I'm going to do that part next. 8 times 7 is 56. Again, you can always use the calculator here. And we write the rest of this down exactly the same as we go. I look, there's no more multiplication or division, so that part is done. And now we move into our last step, the addition and subtraction step. And this part, again, is where we move from left to right. So as I move left to right, I see my first bit here, the 5 plus 56. So that is going to be 61. The rest of this has not changed. I haven't done it. And again, we have our last step here, which is 61 minus 4, which gives us a final answer of 57. So it can be a lot of steps, but the order of operations tells us exactly what to do. We're going to follow that order every single time and see where we end up. So go ahead and pause the video and try the next one on your own. All right, so let's check our work and see how we did. So we're going to start with that grouping symbol. And inside this grouping symbol here, I have a bit more going on than I did before. So we're going to be in this grouping symbol for a little bit. So the 2 cubed plus the 1/3 is going to come down. And now we're going to work inside the parentheses. And once we're inside the parentheses, the order of operations kind of starts over. So I look, I don't have any grouping here. I don't have any exponents. But now I'm in multiplication and division, and I do have 8 divided by 4. So 8 divided by 4 is 2, and we haven't touched the 11 yet, so we're going to have 11 minus 2. For my next step, I haven't gotten rid of the grouping yet, so I'm still working inside that grouping symbol. So the 2 and the 1/3 hasn't changed. And then 11 minus 2 is 9. I'm going to keep the parentheses there because there's this fraction out front, and that fraction means we're going to multiply. So this is really 1/3 times 9. But now we've gotten rid of anything math that we have to do inside the grouping, so we're ready to move on to the exponent stage. So if I look at my question, I do have exponents here. I have 2 cubed. So I'm going to do that. I can use my calculator, and when I do that, I get 8. And everything else stays the same because we didn't use the 1/3, we didn't use the 9 there. And I'm going to get rid of the parentheses there, so it's just not as confusing. Now we're done with our multiplication and division, our exponent, and we are ready to move on to our multiplication and division step. So as we move from left to right, we see that we do have some multiplication right here that we have to take care of. So that's going to be 1/3 times 9. I can type that into Desmos, and I get 3. And the rest of this, the plus sign and the 8, all stays the same. And I am finished with multiplication and division. There's nothing left. So that means our last step now is the addition and subtraction. So as we take a look, we do see that we do have some addition here. We have 8 plus 3, which gives us a final answer of 11. All right, when we have an expression that's the fraction, we start by simplifying the top, Then we simplify the bottom, and then we put it all together. So I'm going to rewrite the top, so it's a little less to look at, a little easier to work with. And now we want to simplify that. So go ahead and pause the video and try and simplify the top or the numerator of that fraction. All right, so to simplify the top, we're going to work our way through the order of operations. We start with the grouping here. So inside there we have 13 minus 3, which is 10. Everything else comes down exactly the same. Then we have one more grouping symbol we have to look out for, which is the square root. So we're going to take care of that. We know that the square root of 196 is 14. And that gets rid of the square root symbol, so that's gone. And we keep working our way down. Now we keep going down the order of operation. No more grouping symbols, but we do have an exponent. So we're going to work on that 10 squared. That's 10 times 10, which is 100. Everything else comes down exactly the same, and that is 114. So we know that the top part of that fraction is 114. So now we need to figure out the bottom part of the fraction. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to copy down the bottom and simplify that. So go ahead and pause the video and try and simplify the denominator. All right, so we work our way through the order of operations. There's no grouping symbol to worry about, but we do have an exponent. So we are going to start with that 4 squared. 4 squared is 13 minus 5 times 2. Then we are done with exponents. We move on to multiplication and division from left to right. We have that 5 times 2 here. So now we have 13 minus 10. And that gives us a final answer of 3 for the bottom of the fraction. Oh, sorry. I made a mistake. 4 squared is not 13. 4 squared is 16. My bad. So now 60 minus 10 is 6. So that gives us our fraction 114 over 6. Now it's important to remember that fractions represent divisions. This is the same thing as 114 divided by 6. And when I do that, I get an answer of 19. All right, go ahead and pause the video and try the last one on your own. All right, for this last one, we have a few grouping symbols, so we're going to work our way from left to right. We're going to start inside the parentheses here. And inside those grouping symbols, the order of operations kind of start over. So we have that square root, which is where we're going to start first. So the square root of 25 is 5, and everything else gets copied down the same as it was above. We're still working inside those parentheses to finish out that grouping symbol. So 9 plus 5 is 14. And again, everything else comes down the same as it is. We're done with that grouping symbol, but we have one more. We have that absolute value here. And the absolute value of negative 4 is 4, because negative 4 is 4 units away from 0. And the 14 minus 6 squared and the division sign all comes down the same. We're done with grouping symbols. We move on to exponents. We do see that we have this 6 squared here. So 6 times 6 is 36. And everything else comes down the same. 14 minus and the division by 4. Now we're in that multiplication division step. We work our way from left to right. So we see 36 divided by 4 here. We know that 36 divided by 4 is 9. So now we have 14 minus 9, which gives us 5 as our answer.